This screencast is going to start with the election of 1824 as we finish discussing the Missouri Compromise in class today. So in this presidential election in 1824, there are 5 candidates running for president, all as Democratic Republicans, because we don't see any other party factions just yet, following the failure of the Federalists. You won't need to know all of these candidates. There are going to be specific ones I have you know about. I will specify which ones. So first off, starting with the first of 3 that I want you to know about, John Quincy Adams, JQA. Remember that he had gained national attention because of his success as the great negotiator. So he was very successful at dealing with diplomatic affairs. Our second candidate is Henry Clay, who we know is the great compromiser, a very prominent politician who ran on a domestic policy platform that included protective tariffs. Recall that a tariff is a tax on imported goods. So the reason a tariff would be perceived as protective is if you have a tariff on an imported item, that means the price of that item is going to go up. So that would encourage citizens to purchase locally made domestic items in order to, protect kind of their domestic made goods. It would make more profit because people would purchase more of them. So that's what a protective tariff is. Not all Americans are in favor of tariffs, but Henry Clay does think they are a good solution for protecting the economy. And the third candidate I want you to know about is Andrew Jackson. And recall that Andrew Jackson was a war hero from the War of 1812, and he was very much more like a common man compared to some of these other candidates. He didn't have a father who was president. He wasn't, prominent in politics, but he was a war hero, and definitely a lot of people liked him for the position of president. So in the election, Andrew Jackson actually walked away with the highest number of popular and electoral votes, but you had to have a certain number to get a absolute majority and to win the election, and no candidate made the minimum needed number of electoral votes to win, so that kind of means there's a tie, and the decision will go to the House of Representatives. The 2 top candidates were Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. Henry Clay was not included in that top selection, so he's out of the race, but Clay will use his influence to have John Quincy Adams elected over Andrew Jackson. Very similar to what Hamilton did for Jefferson in the election where Jefferson won out over Aaron Burr. So again, Henry Clay kind of uses his political influence to have John Quincy Adams made president. The House will elect John Quincy Adams. In return, immediately following JQA's election, he appoints Henry Clay as his Secretary of State, almost as if it was a reward. So that looks a little fishy, especially in politics. That's not the type of practice isn't totally uncommon, but it's just kind of a little suspicious that maybe they had worked out a prior deal. So Jackson is pretty upset about the results of this because he technically had won the popular vote and the majority of electoral votes, but didn't have enough to win, and somehow he lost the election to John Quincy Adams. Jackson will accuse Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams of having a corrupt bargain, which is going to kind of tarnish and hinder JQA's presidency because he's kind of starting off on the wrong foot. So let's talk a little bit about his presidency. I don't have a whole lot to say, and it will also be a one-and-done term. He won't win another election, but he does win and serve for 4 years. People did argue that one reason Henry Clay wanted John Quincy Adams to get elected over Andrew Jackson was that John Quincy Adams supported Clay's domestic policies. He supports tariffs. So just know that we're going to start seeing some tariffs passed under JQA's presidency. The South is not happy about the idea of tariffs, okay? The South doesn't feel like they want or need protective tariffs. Their cotton is already the cheapest in the world. It doesn't need to be protected by a tariff. So tariffs just upset their trading partners, because recall that the South is trading cotton and selling cotton to Europe where it's in such high demand. And that's who will be taxed with a tariff, are European countries coming in and trading with us. So bottom line is they don't really want to upset their trading partners. They don't want the tariff to be put in place in the first place at all, to be honest. So, nonetheless, John Quincy Adams will pass a tariff towards the end of his political term, 1828. It's simply just called the Tariff of 1828. The South will hate this tariff, and they will call this tariff the Tariff of Abominations. Okay? They are not happy about that tariff overall. Nonetheless, just like his father, John Quincy Adams doesn't do a whole lot to be very popular overall. So in the election of 1828, we're going to see another president elected. Jackson was just looking better and better at this point. He was becoming even more popular during Adams' presidency. He's going to win the election of 1828 very easily, and his supporters, the supporters of Andrew Jackson, are going to start calling themselves Democrats, which translates to, being ruled by the people. The people are in power. And because he's a man of the people and a common man, people think that if he's elected, they'll have more control of government. So that's why they start calling themselves Democrats. So he wins that election easily, and John C. Calhoun, as pictured on the screen, is his VP, Vice President. I want to talk about just two aspects of Jackson's presidency today, and then we will save the rest for in class tomorrow. But let me just go on record and say it's very controversial. He doesn't do a whole lot of non-controversial things during his presidency. The first thing we're going to talk about is the spoil system. So as part of Jackson's philosophy, he sought to give the common people a chance to participate in government, people that otherwise maybe would not have the means or ability to participate in government. So he's going to do this through the spoil system. Under the spoil system, he is going to hire his own supporters to replace the entire cabinet and administration of the former president. So all those administrative positions that were filled by JQA, Jackson's going to kind of clean house and put his own friends and political allies in government positions under his administration. Now, because of this, his cabinet becomes known as the kitchen cabinet. And the theory is that they were, he was close enough and friendly enough with his cabinet members that they came through the White House, through the kitchen door, not through the front door, not the proper way of entering politics, but through the side door, okay, through knowing the right people, if that makes sense. Just because they're his friends and political allies does not necessarily mean that they are qualified for office. So that's a bit of a controversial decision on Jackson's part. I mean, several presidents, of course, follow suit by appointing their own friends and people who align their views, or share the same views as them politically. But usually those people still have some sort of, justification and experience for being in that position. They're not hired out of the blue. But that is the spoil system. All right, the next event we're going to talk about is the Nullification Crisis. So, not necessarily with Jackson's full support, but later on in his presidency, Congress will pass a second tariff. So now we have that 1828 tariff of abominations that the South hated, and we also have a tariff in 1832. You don't have to know the year of that by any means, but Congress passed another high tariff, and South Carolina is going to get a little feisty and get a little brave, and they are going to decide to nullify. And I have the word nullification spelled out on the screen for you, so nullify just has a Y at the end instead of the I. But they are going to decide to nullify both of these recently passed tariffs. To nullify something means to void it, like null and void. They're not going to acknowledge it. They're going to say that they are not applicable or unconstitutional. Basically, South Carolina says, we aren't going to collect those taxes in our state. We're not recognizing those tariffs and we're not collecting those taxes. South Carolina also threatens to secede. Secede, y'all, is spelled S-E-C-E-D-E, okay? South Carolina threatens to secede if the federal government tries to intervene and force the collection of taxes. Secession means to leave the Union. So we know this will eventually happen in the Civil War, because that's how the Civil War starts, but we're still 30 years out from that. So South Carolina, it's 30 years before the Civil War. South Carolina is already threatening to leave the Union and break away from the United States if the United States tries to force them to collect these taxes. Now, let's just be honest for a second. Jackson's a man of the people. He doesn't like the idea of tariffs that much either, especially when the people don't support them. But he definitely doesn't like the idea of nullification or secession. He doesn't like any state coming out and challenging his authority as president and leader of the federal government. He feels like states don't have the constitutional right to leave the Union or challenge the central government's authority. So he is going to respond to South Carolina's threat of secession and nullification with a bill called the Force Bill. The Force Bill gives the president the authority to use military force against the state that would refuse to obey a national law. So basically, for any state that refuses to obey the national law, the federal government has the right to intervene with the use of the U.S. military. So you have South Carolina threatening to leave. You have the president threatening to insert the military and take control. This situation is turning out to be very tense and does not look good between these two factions. So when you are in need of a compromise, who are you going to call? Of course, our old friend Henry Clay, right? I told you he's the great compromiser. He's going to come up in several points in our notes. So Henry Clay is going to propose a compromise tariff called the Tariff Act. The Tariff Act would basically the federal government would agree to gradually reduce the tariffs over time. They're not going to avoid either one of them, but they promise to gradually reduce the percentage of the tax like every year to where that they wouldn't be as drastic and dramatic. And this compromise does work because South Carolina will withdraw their nullification threat, and they start collecting the taxes on the tariffs. But in an act of defiance, they did decide to nullify or void the Force Act, just to be extra sassy. If you're not familiar with where the story's headed, South Carolina is kind of one of the main instigators of the Civil War and this Civil War era. So they definitely act out against the North several times and against the federal government. But Jackson felt satisfied with this compromise as well because he was able to kind of walk away with the proof that a state could not nullify a federal law. Even if a state doesn't like a law, that's too bad. Like, the federal government is supreme. You can't challenge the federal government's authority. And that's kind of what his issue was, because he just didn't like the fact that people were trying to disobey him. He wanted to assert his authority as president. This is just the beginning of Jackson drama, so we will continue talking about this more in class tomorrow. Please write down any questions you have, and I will see you all tomorrow.